Trust in politics is broken. So can we get UK politics working again?
That was the last time we were happy. 2012.
I'm Beth Rigby, Sky's political editor. Join me every week with Labour's Jess Phillips and Conservative peer Ruth Davidson for some electoral dysfunction.
This idea of nuance has completely left politics.
Yeah. Together, we'll focus on the policies that could deliver political satisfaction. Follow electoral dysfunction wherever you get your podcasts.
After spending the weekend reflecting on what is best for my party, for the government and for the country I lead, I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm. I have therefore informed the SNP's National Secretary of my intention to stand down as party leader and ask that she commences a leadership contest for my replacement as soon as possible.
It wasn't meant to end this way for Humza Yousaf. To become leader of the Scottish National Party and therefore Scotland's sixth First Minister and the first who wasn't white, he'd overcome some serious challenges, not least in a bruising leadership campaign. 1 year and 1 month later, he is gone. And in a Shakespearean twist worthy of the Scottish play, it was one of the women he beat in that leadership contest who held his future in her hands. That's Ash Regan, and we'll hear more about her and all the other protagonists in this intriguing political tale during the course of this episode of the Sky News Daily with me, Matt Barbet. So how do we get here? Sky News Scotland correspondent Conor Gillis has been following things very closely, including chasing Humza Yousaf around Scotland the past few days. Conor, he had big shoes to fill when he came to lead the SNP and leading a party that had been in power for a long time already at that point.
Yeah, that's quite the introduction, chasing Humza Yousaf around Scotland the last few days. I think that's fair to say that has been the case because he's been chopping and changing his position so much.
And Conor, it was the disagreement, the falling out with the Green Party that he shared power with that led to this moment today. And in his leaving speech, he admitted that that seemed to be a mistake, the way he was handling that. So it begs the question, was Humza Yousaf politically astute enough for the top job?
I'm standing here in Edinburgh at Bute House, the official residence of the First Minister of Scotland. It's just on a kind of suburban street not far from the main city centre. And the Bute House Agreement, as it was called, was essentially a coalition between the SNP and the Greens. It was set up in 2021 by the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. And the whole point was to try and create a pro-independence majority at Holyrood, which would make it easier to pass budgets, to pass key votes in the Parliament. And that worked well for a while for both the parties, certainly worked well for the Greens. But there has been disquiet. There's been growing unease among key SNP senior figures in the past year or so, particularly around the Greens' influence in government and whether they have overreached in their authority. And it came to a head recently in terms of the SNP Green Pact ditching climate targets. That was a humiliation for the Greens. In government, we think the only Greens in government in the world where they were part of a climate climb down on their targets. There's also been some disquiet around gender reform. But why this is so interesting, and it kind of goes back to the drama that this has become, is because Tuesday of last week, Humza Yousaf, the First Minister of Scotland, told Sky News that that partnership with the Greens was worth its weight in gold. And then 48 hours later, he summoned the Green ministers here to Bute House in Edinburgh, where he sacked them. And I think the admission today here in his resignation speech was that he clearly, dramatically, sensationally miscalculated how the Greens would react, because they said that they would then knock back a no-confidence motion that is looming in the Scottish Parliament this week on his leadership. And he didn't factor that in to his sums when he sacked them. So the writing was on the wall at that stage. He has battled ever since to save his political career. You talk about chasing him around the country and pursuing him. Well, we were trying to ask valid questions about whether he could survive this no-confidence vote, given all of the opposition parties were engineering that in a way where it could prove fatal.
And then we get to this morning and you're suddenly breaking the news that he was considering his position.
I had a conversation with a very senior source close to Humza Yousaf just before 7 o'clock this morning, Monday morning. And they had said that they were looking at a situation where they would have had to strike a deal with the Alba party. They have one MSP, and that person is Ash Regan, who defected from the SNP when she lost the leadership contest in the SNP last year.
Of course, Conor, Alex Salmond is someone who has an axe to grind against his former party, the SNP.
He is a man with a bitter feud against the SNP. They do not like each other, and they haven't done for quite a number of years. So going back to that conversation at 7 o'clock this morning with a close source towards Humza Yousaf, they were saying, look, that is like doing a deal with the devil. So you either box yourself into that or you do the other option, which is to resign. And the walls were closing in. He had no other option. He was going to lose that vote. And rather than do a deal with Alex Salmond, he walked away.
It's not confusing, Conor. It truly is Shakespearean, like I said, for all these storylines that come in with Salmond's axe to grind with the SNP and Ash Regan suddenly coming back to prominence, having been beaten in that leadership contest. Let's focus on the other woman in that leadership contest and others who may now want to take over as leader of the SNP and therefore First Minister for a bit. You mentioned Kate Forbes. We know that she's likely to throw a hat back in the ring. Who else could take over from Humza Yousaf and be the 7th First Minister of Scotland?
John Swinney, the very close ally to Nicola Sturgeon and Humza Yousaf, is seen as a steady pair of hands, a safe pair of hands to steady the SNP through yet another crisis. He has said that he is very actively considering standing to be the next SNP leader. Now, he has been the SNP leader in the past. Back in 2000, I think, he was around for 4 years, but that was before the SNP was the big, dominant political force that it is today. Nevertheless, he is a grandee of the party. He has the authority, he has the respect among party members, and is he the man that could sort out this mess, for want of a better phrase, that the SNP finds itself in now with Humza Yousaf departing office? I think if he declares that he is going to stand to be the next leader, it'll be very, very hard for anyone else to come into the mix there. We've got a big election year ahead. We need a safe pair of hands, and I'm the man to do it. Let's see what happens.
And Conor, let me just finish by asking you, having spent so much time with Humza Yousaf, having spoken to him a lot over recent days, and obviously having seen him get emotional in that press conference, especially when he was talking about his family, what's he like as a man? What's he been like as a person to deal with professionally?
His opponents could say a lot about his integrity, his credibility, as the SNP leader and as the First Minister of Scotland. But when his career was on the ropes just on Friday there, and there was a suggestion that he might quit a few days ago, rather than shield away from the press, from the media, from us who were all waiting with bated breath to ask him questions about whether he would stay or whether he would go, he arrived in Dundee on Friday, and I think there was about 20 media interviews. We were told we were going to get 2 questions each, and he just spoke and answered each and every question. So would you get that with all politicians? Certainly not. Did you get that with Humza Yousaf? Yes, you did. He fought his candidacy last year on openness and transparency. I think even his harshest critics would suggest that that is not something that he delivered in office.
So where does this leave the Scottish National Party and the independence movement for Scotland overall? In a moment, we'll dig into that. So, Humza Yousaf is gone, but where does that leave his party, the SNP, who've held power in Scotland for the last 17 years? Paul Hutcheon is political editor of the Daily Record, and Shona Craven is community editor and columnist at The National. They've both been watching the comings and goings of Holyrood for much of that time. Let me ask you, Shona, first. Why is the Scottish National Party seemingly in such dire straits at the moment? Because a lot of people making comparisons with the Conservatives in Westminster.
Well, I don't think that is merited at all. I mean, we've had Humza Yousaf in post for a year, which until recently might have seemed like quite a short tenure, but obviously if we look at Westminster, perhaps less so. He's inherited a lot of difficult situations, one of which was this Bute House agreement with the Scottish Greens, which presented some problems to him in terms of the amount of power that the Greens were wielding. So there was the threat that the Greens were going to leave the SNP, and Humza Yousaf opted to instead ditch the Greens, which he maintains was the right thing to do. But what he concedes now is that he went the wrong way about it, and he underestimated the strength of feeling within the Greens and what that might mean for his position, as we've found out, and he's found out to his cost.
I think just to pick up on the point that Shona made there, the manner in which he ditched the Greens was just so inept politically. To do it in such a brutal way by essentially making walk the walk of shame outside of his residence in front of the cameras, he didn't need to do it that way. He could have showed tact, sensitivity, and particularly given that he would need them in any confidence vote. So I do feel like that was the big call that he had to make as First Minister, and the way he went about it was wrong. But make no mistake, if he hadn't ended the Bute House agreement in the way he had ended it, he'd still be First Minister just now.
The reason there was that agreement in the first place is because the Greens, like the SNP, were pro-independence, as are the Labour Party, which was obviously founded by Alex Salmond post his time in the Scottish National Party. With all this mess now, Shona, where does this leave the movement for independence in Scotland?
Well, it's always worth pointing out that support for independence remains strong, consistently around the 50% mark in polls. The SNP, their fortunes have suffered. Their polling is weaker. So you have a movement that is still wanting independence, that is still looking at what's going on in Westminster in utter dismay and thinking we can surely do better than this. So the SNP is a broad church. That is a positive thing. And as we saw last year with the leadership election, there is a diversity of views on all sorts of things. But I don't know that we'll see that same type of contest this time around. I think with a Holyrood election 2 years away, the people who really want to make a difference in the SNP, they want to lead a majority government. They don't really want to inherit a minority one that's in this difficult pickle.
What do you think about the independence movement at the moment? Because it's pretty telling, isn't it, Paul, that some of those big names, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond, have already talked about, they cast very big shadows over everything still now, don't they?
If Scotland is ever to become independent, the springboard of that is a successful SNP government. And we don't have that just now. And another plank of that is that if Scotland's become independent, there's going to have to be a referendum at some point. But the SNP government can't deliver on that. And if the UK government keeps saying no, which is what they're doing, there is no plan B around that. And I think that is part of the problem for the independence movement. There is no agreed strategy on how to get to their destination because all roads have been closed off. You may argue that's fair, you may argue it's undemocratic, but it's just a fact of life. And so we end up in a situation where Humza Yousaf, the outgoing First Minister, came up with a policy. I think it was the SNP winning a majority of seats at the general election. That's not a strategy that has united the independence movement at all. And you just have to look at the last couple of weeks. The SNP have kicked out the Scottish Greens from the government. The Greens will not share a platform with Alaba. Senior figures in the SNP despise Alex Salmond. And Alex Salmond, I think, for some people, has used Alaba as a sort of revenge mission on the SNP. That's not a united independence movement. I know that the independence movement is wider than political parties, but political parties are pretty fundamental parts of that movement. And you can just see the different parties turning on each other, and I'm not sure how they can put it back together.
Humza Yousaf leaves. I mean, he might have a little while yet because he's a caretaker for the time being, but he leaves after 13 months. What do you both think his legacy will be? Paul first.
I think his legacy is probably a negative one in that I think his time in office shows that if you want to be a minority government, you have to show tact, guile and cunning. And he failed to do that in the manner in which he ditched the Greens. You need a politician who can build bridges, who can work across the aisle, and who recognises that you will need the support of the Scottish Greens because the pro-UK parties will not come to your rescue for things like budgets or legislation. So I think that he made a big political miscalculation, a big political blunder, and that is going to define his time in office.
Yeah, Shona, I mean, Paul's not the first to talk about blunders when it comes to Humza Yousaf. Others saying he's been gaffe-prone. What do you think his legacy is?
I think it's unfair to suggest that Humza Yousaf's been gaffe prone, and I think it is a real shame that the manner of his exit will perhaps come to characterise his leadership, because I think he actually showed a lot of tact and sensitivity. He, throughout the leadership campaign, was very sort of civil compared to perhaps his opponents at times not being so. I think he is very well liked. I think a lot of people have said quite uncharitable things like he's a nice guy, but he's not a leader and things like this. But he hadn't really had the chance to put his own mark and to set his own agenda. He had inherited a lot of things, some of which, when he was Justice Secretary, the hate crime bill was introduced and that caused a big stooshy. However, we'll need to judge in the long run how that policy and how that change in the law actually makes a difference. I think he will be remembered for his leadership with regard to Gaza. Obviously, he had a very personal family interest in that conflict, but I think he earned a lot of praise, even from people who are not SNP supporters or indeed independent supporters. So I think he will be remembered for that. So I think he will be remembered as someone who took on a job at a really, really difficult time and did the absolute best he could with it.
Let's finish off by trying to think about what happens next. In the conversation with Connor earlier, we talked about who may be the leading contenders to take over from Humza Yousaf. John Swinney, of course, a grandee of the SNP, Kate Forbes, who was beaten in the last leadership contest. Stephen Flynn, who's leader of the SNP in Westminster, is a name that crops up, as does Neil Gray, who's Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care in the Scottish Parliament. Whoever it happens to be, they're not going to get awfully long, Shona, are they, to stamp their mark with an election due to take place in 2026? Whoever it is, they've got their work cut out.
Yeah, I feel for John Swinney because there is a lot of pressure on him. And John Swinney didn't run last year. He doesn't want to do this again. But I think for these 2 years, he may be willing to just try and gain some stability, gain back some trust from the Greens and just keep things ticking over, which is the last thing impatient independent supporters want to hear. But I think if I was Kate Forbes, I would want to be able to go into an election and let the people decide whether they agree with her priorities, rather than letting the Scottish Greens decide if they are willing to allow her to become First Minister. So I think ambitious politicians possibly see what's happened to Humza and think, well, I don't want that to happen to me. I want to lead a majority SNP government and lead the country to independence. And that will take some time.
But I would point out that to make minority government work, you need the support of your own group, and you need to be able to build bridges with the other parties. I would very much doubt whether Kate Forbes has it in her to unite her own group. When you have someone who does not believe that gay people should be able to get married, who is anti-abortion, who said some curious things on buffer zones, is she really going to be able to unite her group on a day-to-day basis? I think there are many people who've got their doubts about that.
These are undoubtedly conversations for the coming weeks and months, but for now, thank you both very much indeed. That's Paul Hutcheon from the Daily Record and Shona Craven from The National. In reality, that's not quite it for Humza Yousaf. He said he will stay on as First Minister until his successor is elected. And also this week, there is a fairly crucial vote of confidence in the Scottish National Party as well. So all eyes on that. But that's it for today from this edition of the Sky News Daily. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow.